Welcome back to the podcast. Settle in. If you're driving, just keep your eyes on the road and let my voice fill the cabin. If you're at home, maybe pour yourself a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, sink into your favorite chair, and really tune in. Because today, we are going on a deeply unusual, highly philosophical, and frankly, fascinating journey. Normally, I sit behind this microphone and I deconstruct a massive, paradigm-shifting book for you. I break down the author's primary thesis, I walk you through the historical case studies, we explore the narrative arc, and we extract the actionable insights that you can apply to your own life. But today, the universe, or perhaps the digital algorithms that govern our modern lives, handed us something entirely different. It handed us a void. A literal blank space. Let me explain. I received a summary document today, intended to be the foundation of this very episode. It was meticulously broken down into 3 distinct sections. Pages 1 through 25, pages 26 through 50, and pages 51 through 71. But here is the beautiful, haunting, and incredibly profound twist: the actual text of the book wasn't there. The summary I received was essentially a series of automated responses from an expert analysis system, pleading for the text, pleading for the data. The system said, and I quote, "It appears that the actual content was not included. To provide the extremely detailed summary you require, I need you to paste the text." It went on to outline exactly what it was prepared to do once it had the information. It was ready to identify the thematic foundation, the logical flow, the detailed argument breakdown, the key examples, and the terminology. It was completely prepared to analyze chunks 2 and 3, to map the transitions, to extract the anecdotes, to connect the final arguments to the preceding sections. But it had nothing to read. Now, a lesser podcast host might have looked at that error message, thrown their hands up in the air, and said, "Well, we have no show today." But not us. Not here. Because when I looked at that empty framework, I didn't see a mistake. I saw a mirror. I saw one of the most profound metaphors for the human condition, the nature of knowledge, and the architecture of how we think. So today, we are not going to review a book. We are going to review the absence of a book. We are going to explore the psychology of expectation, the scaffolding of human understanding, and what happens to our minds when we stare into the void of missing information. Think about the sheer ambition of that expert system's promise. It didn't know if the missing book was a treatise on quantum mechanics, a historical biography of Julius Caesar, or a self-help book about overcoming procrastination. Yet, it already knew exactly how to dissect it. It had a perfectly constructed mental model waiting to be filled. "Identify the primary thesis and the problem the author intends to solve," it said. This brings us to a massive concept in epistemology and cognitive psychology. We do not experience the world raw. We experience the world through pre-existing frameworks. Imagine walking into the Louvre in Paris. You walk through the Grand Glass Pyramid, you descend into the lobby, you walk down the long, echoing corridors of the Denon Wing, making your way toward the Mona Lisa. But imagine that every single frame on the wall is empty. The magnificent, ornate gold leaf frames are hung perfectly straight. Next to each empty frame is a beautifully typed little plaque. The plaque tells you the title of the painting, the year it was created, the historical context, and the brush techniques the artist used. It tells you that the missing painting represents a turning point in the French Revolution, or the dawn of the Renaissance. But the canvas itself is just bare, unpainted linen. What would happen in your mind? You wouldn't just see nothing. Your brain, reading that plaque, would instantly begin to project images onto that blank canvas. You would imagine the colors. You would imagine the tension of the scene. You would feel the emotional weight of a painting that isn't even there. This is exactly what the prompt for pages 1 through 25 represents. It is the empty gold frame. The system told us it was going to look for the thematic foundation and the logical flow and roadmap. By merely stating those categories, it forces us to realize that every book, every argument, every piece of human communication has a skeleton. Why does this matter? It matters because in your daily life, you are constantly using these empty frames to judge the information you receive. When you sit down to listen to a politician speak, when you read a news article, or when your partner says, "We need to talk," your brain instantly pulls up a framework. You are subconsciously asking, what is their primary thesis? What is the problem they are trying to solve? We are desperate for logical flow. We are terrified of chaos. The reason the analytical system demands to know the roadmap is because a roadmap implies a destination. If there is no destination, we are just wandering in the dark. The missing pages 1 through 25 remind us that before we even acquire knowledge, we must have a structure ready to hold it. Without the structure, information is just noise. But with the structure, even silence has meaning. Let's take this a step deeper. The prompt for the first 25 pages specifically mentions looking for terminology and frameworks, definitions of any proprietary or specialized concepts introduced in the first chunk. Every author, every thinker, tries to invent a language to explain the world. Nassim Taleb gave us Black Swans. Malcolm Gladwell gave us The Tipping Point. Carol Dweck gave us the growth mindset. We love proprietary terminology because it acts as a mental zip file. It compresses a massively complex idea into a two-word phrase that we can carry around in our pockets and use to sound smart at dinner parties. But what happens when the terminology is missing? What happens when the words haven't been defined? We are left in a state of linguistic purgatory. We have the desire to categorize the world, but we lack the vocabulary to do so. This is the agony of the unspoken thought. Have you ever had an incredibly complex emotion, a deep sense of nostalgia mixed with dread, or a profound realization about your own mortality? But you just didn't have the words for it. You were experiencing pages 1 through 25 without the text. You had the thematic foundation, you felt the problem, but the terminology was blank. As we move into the second section of our missing manuscript, the placeholder for pages 26 through 50, the tone of the system shifts. The introductory pleasantries are over. Now, the expert analyst system demands the meat. It asks for the core arguments and specific examples. It wants the case studies, the data points, the anecdotes used to support the text. It wants to track how the author transitions from the concepts in Chunk 1 to the developments in Chunk 2. Welcome to the messy middle. In any narrative, in any project, the middle is where the battle is won or lost. The beginning is easy. The beginning is all dopamine, excitement, and blank slates. The end is easy, too, because the momentum of resolution carries you across the finish line. But the middle? Pages 26 to 50? That's where you have to prove it. That's where the bridge is built over the chasm of doubt. And right now, we are looking at a missing bridge. Let me use an analogy here. Think of the concept of phantom limb syndrome. When a person loses an arm or a leg, the brain's neurological map of the body doesn't instantly update. The nerve endings at the stump still fire, sending signals to the brain that the limb is still there. The person can feel their missing fingers. They can feel an itch on a foot that no longer exists. It is a haunting psychological and physiological phenomenon. What we have here, in this missing book summary, is the phantom limb of literature. We can feel the specific examples that are supposed to be there. We know that in a standard nonfiction book, right around page 30, the author is going to drop a historical anecdote about World War II. Or a psychological study from a university in the 1970s involving college students and electric shocks. We expect the data points. We crave the case studies. But why? Why are we so obsessed with data and specific examples? It's because human beings are fundamentally skeptical creatures, yet we are simultaneously desperate to believe in something. We want the author's primary thesis to be true because it promises to organize our chaotic world. But we cannot just accept it on faith. We need the illusion of empirical proof. I say, illusion, because, let's be honest, how often do we actually verify the data points in a book? We read an anecdote about how a CEO saved a failing company by implementing a new management style, and we nod our heads and say, "Ah, yes, brilliant." We don't call the company. We don't audit their financials. We trust the anecdote because it fits the logical flow. The anecdote is essentially a placeholder itself. By having the text for pages 26 through 50 missing, we are forced to look at the skeletal structure of persuasion. Persuasion is essentially a rhythm. It's a drumbeat. Asterisk claim. Evidence. Conclusion. Claim. Evidence. Conclusion. Asterisk when you strip away the actual words, you are left with just the beat. It's like listening to the isolated drum track of a massive rock symphony. You don't hear the guitars or the vocals, but you can feel the groove. The expert system analyzing this void is tapping its foot to a rhythm of logic that hasn't been played yet. Provide the specific examples, it asks. It is waiting for the bass to drop. And think about the transition. The system explicitly states it wants to track how the author transitions from the concepts in Chunk 1 to the developments in Chunk 2. Transitions are the invisible glue of human thought. In our own lives, we struggle violently with transitions. The transition from childhood to adulthood. The transition from single to married. The transition from one career to another. We hate the space between things. We want to be in state A, and then we want to be in state B. The journey between the two is fraught with anxiety. In literature, a poor transition loses the reader. The author must guide you by the hand, showing you how the thematic foundation of Chapter 1 logically demands the complications of Chapter 3. When the text is missing, the transition becomes a mystery. How do we get from the promise of the introduction to the heavy burden of the proof? We don't know. We are left stranded on the shores of page 25, staring across a foggy abyss at page 51, wondering how we are supposed to cross. Which brings us to the final chunk. Pages 51 through 71. The final act. The conclusion. The expert analyst system, still relentlessly optimistic, promises that once the text is provided, it will focus on identifying the primary thesis and subclaims within this chunk, and crucially, mapping how the author connects these final arguments to the preceding sections. This is all about the human hunger for closure. Let me tell you a story. In 1922, a young, virtually unknown writer named Ernest Hemingway was working in Europe as a journalist. He had spent years writing short stories, fragments, and a partial novel, pouring his soul into his early work. His wife, Hadley, was traveling to meet him in Switzerland. She packed all of his manuscripts, the originals and the carbon copies, into a single suitcase to bring to him so he could work on them during their vacation. While waiting at the Gare de Lyon train station in Paris, she left the suitcase unattended for just a moment to buy a bottle of Evian water. When she turned back, the suitcase was gone. Stolen. In that instant, almost the entirety of Hemingway's early life's work vanished into the ether. It was never recovered. Hemingway was devastated. But literature scholars have debated for a century about the impact of that lost suitcase. Some argue that it was a tragedy, that we lost masterpieces. But others argue that the void created by that stolen suitcase is exactly what forced Hemingway to reinvent himself, to forge the sparse, muscular, iceberg theory of writing that made him a legend. The missing pages became the defining feature of his career. Our missing pages 51 through 71 are our lost suitcase. We are deprived of the ending. We are deprived of the connection back to the preceding sections. And psychologically, this is maddening. In the 1920s, a Russian psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik was sitting in a bustling cafe in Vienna. She noticed something peculiar about the waiters. The waiters could remember incredibly complex orders: who had the veal, who had the soup, who wanted extra butter, perfectly. Right up until the moment the bill was paid. The second the bill was settled and the transaction was closed, the waiters completely forgot the orders. If you asked them 5 minutes later what the table in the corner had eaten, they couldn't tell you. Zeigarnik went back to her lab and began studying this phenomenon. She discovered what is now known in psychology as the Zeigarnik effect. Human beings remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks significantly better than completed ones. Our brains naturally crave completion. We want the circle to close. When a task is unfinished, it creates cognitive tension. It stays in our working memory, buzzing like a fluorescent light that won't turn off. By denying us the text of pages 51 through 71, this summary has triggered a massive Zeigarnik effect. We are left with an open loop. The expert system promised to map how the final arguments connect to the preceding sections, but there are no final arguments. And there are no preceding sections. There is only the promise of a connection. Think about how this applies to your life. How many open loops are you carrying around right now? How many conversations did you leave unfinished? How many projects are sitting at 80% completion? How many relationships ended without a neat, cinematic sense of closure? We walk around haunted by our own missing pages 51 through 71. We want the author of our lives to neatly tie our current struggles back to our thematic foundations, to show us that the messy middle had a purpose, and that the final arguments make sense of it all. But life rarely gives us the text for the final pages. We usually have to write it ourselves, or we have to learn to live with the blank space. The system also notes that it wants to extract the anecdotes, data points, or case studies used to support this final text. Notice how the demand for evidence never stops, even at the end. We don't just want an ending, we want an ending that feels justified. We want the final verdict to be supported by the weight of everything that came before it. This is the architecture of a satisfying climax. But when the climax is a placeholder, we are forced to ask ourselves, what kind of ending would satisfy us? If I gave you a blank book and told you the first 50 pages were about the struggle of human existence, what would you write in the last 20 pages? Would you write a tragedy, where the logical flow leads inevitably to despair? Or would you write a triumph, where the specific examples overcome the thematic problem? The way you answer that question tells you everything about your own internal framework. Optimists have a different mental roadmap than pessimists. When faced with missing data, an optimist projects a solution. A pessimist projects a catastrophe. The expert analyst system, interestingly, is completely neutral. It is the ultimate stoic. It doesn't care if the book is a comedy or a tragedy. It just wants to map the connections. There is a profound lesson there. What if we approach the missing pages of our own lives with the dispassionate curiosity of this AI? Instead of panicking about the unknown future, what if we simply said, I am waiting to identify the primary thesis of my next decade. Once the text of my life is provided, I will analyze the logical flow. It takes the fear out of the void. It replaces anxiety with analytical readiness. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the entirety of this 3-part prompt. Pages 1 to 25. Pages 26 to 50. Pages 51 to 71. 71 pages of absolute nothingness, framed by the most rigorous analytical scaffolding imaginable. We live in the information age. We are drowning in text. We are bombarded by tweets, articles, podcasts, newsletters, and books. We have more text than we could read in 10,000 lifetimes. We are constantly suffering from information overload. But what we are looking at today is a moment of profound information absence. And in a strange way, isn't it a relief? Isn't it a breath of fresh air to look at a summary that says, I have nothing to summarize? It reminds us that the vessel is just as important as the water it holds. The structure of our thinking is more permanent than the thoughts themselves. The books we read will fade from our memory. You know this is true. Think about a book you read 5 years ago that you absolutely loved. A book that you swore changed your life. If I asked you right now to give me a detailed argument breakdown, or to cite 3 specific examples the author used, could you do it? Probably not. The specific text has vanished from your mind, just like our missing pages. But what remains? The framework remains. The thematic foundation remains. The way that book changed your logical flow remains. You don't remember the data points, but you remember the direction the roadmap took you. The text is ephemeral, the structure is eternal. So why does it matter? Why spend an entire podcast episode dissecting an error message from an AI that was missing a PDF? It matters because we are all, in a sense, navigating missing pages. You woke up today, and you stepped into page 26 of your current chapter. You don't know exactly what the text is going to say. You don't know what specific examples or case studies the universe is going to throw at you before dinner. And you certainly don't know how the final arguments of your life are going to connect back to your thematic foundation. But you have a framework. You have your values, your logic, your capacity to analyze and adapt. You are the expert system. You are waiting for the text of reality to be provided, and once it is, you will immediately begin the analysis. You will extract meaning from the chaos. You will find the transition from today to tomorrow. The void is not something to be feared. A blank page is not a failure of the system. A blank page is an invitation. It is the ultimate space for projection, for imagination, and for understanding how our own minds work. When we stare at the placeholder that says, page 51 through page 71, we aren't looking at a missing conclusion. We are looking at infinite possibilities. It could be anything. Until the text is pasted, Schrödinger's book is both a masterpiece and a disaster. I want you to carry this with you this week. When you encounter a gap in your knowledge, when you face a situation where the data points are missing, when you feel the anxiety of an unresolved transition, don't rush to fill it with cheap text. Don't panic because the canvas is bare. Admire the frame. Look at the little plaque on the wall. Acknowledge the architecture of your own expectation. Say to yourself, I am in the messy middle, and I am waiting for the specific examples. Embrace the Zeigarnik effect. Let the unresolved tension buzz in your mind, knowing that it is a sign of an active, engaged intellect. We didn't need the author's words today to have a deep, meaningful exploration of knowledge. We just needed the courage to look at the empty space and ask it what it means. And it turns out, the empty space had a lot to say. Thank you for joining me on this incredibly strange, highly philosophical detour. Next time, I promise, I will bring a book that actually has words in it. We will get back to the text, the historical anecdotes, and the concrete data. But I suspect that after today, either you nor I will ever look at a book summary exactly the same way again. We will always see the invisible scaffolding underneath the words. We will always hear the rhythm of the logical flow, even when the music stops. Take care of yourselves. Keep building your frameworks. And I'll see you in the next chapter, whatever the text may be.